Multiple guilty pleas today from the truck driver involved in last year's deadly Humboldt Broncos bus crash. Jaskirat Sidhu appeared in a Melfort, Saskatchewan courtroom earlier. He pleaded guilty to 16 counts of dangerous driving causing death and 13 counts of dangerous driving causing bodily harm. The collision happened on a remote road last April while the Humboldt Broncos hockey team was heading to a playoff game. Sidhu has been out on bail since July. His lawyers say they will be making a statement a little later today. We can tell you that the sentencing hearing begins on January the 28th. Well, the father of Evan Thomas, one of the Bronco victims, did speak with the media today after Sidhu's court appearance. He will make a victim impact statement a little later this month. But so far, this is what we've heard from Scott Thomas. He said this right after Sidhu pleaded guilty.
We all formed our own opinions of what happened that day, and of course that's clearly going to come out in court in the statement of facts. And I knew what my opinion was when I walked up on that accident scene. It meant right from the start, and all I've ever told my kids is speaking about accountability and responsibility, and to hear him use his own words to plead guilty. To acknowledge what we felt right from the start, that he was responsible for that accident scene. And we can look forward to the next part of this.
His lawyer outside the courthouse actually said that Sidhu feels it's his fault. What do those words specifically mean to you?
It means a lot. We said a few times from the start of this, a whole bunch of things had to go wrong for the scale of that tragedy. We're working to fix some of them. Of course, all the safety things you have in the world can't prevent someone from robbing in a stop sign, which he clearly did. So yeah, so that's his fault.
And again, that was Scott Thomas, the father of one of the victims. Now, the CBC's Bonnie Allen was in the courtroom when Sidhu pleaded guilty to all charges. She has the latest from just outside the courthouse in Melfort, Saskatchewan.
Well, the mood was certainly tense with a lot of anticipation because people knew that if he stood up and said not guilty, that could mean a prolonged court process and criminal trial, which the family said would be too difficult and emotional. Jaskirat Sidhu stood up in a black suit and tie and said 5 words: "I plead guilty, Your Honor." And there was an audible gasp among the 3 families that were in the courtroom to hear those words from him. As you said, he pleaded guilty to 16 counts of dangerous driving causing death and 13 counts of dangerous driving causing bodily injury. Now, the dangerous driving charge would carry a maximum sentence of 14 years in prison. The bodily injury charge would be a maximum sentence of 10 years. Now, this wasn't a foregone conclusion, Andrew. Many people thought that it was obvious what had happened. We still don't actually know all the circumstances around what led up to that collision. But by pleading guilty, he is admitting that he at least blew through the stop sign. But even that doesn't always qualify, as dangerous driving. Yeah, there have been Supreme Court cases that say simple carelessness doesn't always qualify as dangerous driving or even as a criminal matter. The Chief Justice has said that even good drivers are subject to momentary lapses of attention. So in this case, he has decided to plead guilty, to take full responsibility. His lawyer says that Sidhu directed him not to take a plea deal, not to go to trial, that he wanted to take responsibility. He knows he cannot make things better, but he doesn't want to make things worse. And he says he appreciates expressions of sympathy that he has received from some Humboldt Broncos families.
Certainly an interesting aspect of what has come out today, but we also know that at least one father who lost a son, we're talking about Scott Thomas, whose son Evan died in the crash, he was in the courtroom. Tell us about his reaction to everything that happened inside, and tell us about what he said outside the courtroom after the guilty plea was entered.
Yeah, certainly, Michael. Scott Thomas was in the courtroom, and going in, he said that it would be very difficult for him. Coming out, he had tears in his eyes still, and he said that that moment when he heard guilty, that gave him the closure that he needed. He really said that that's all he needed to hear, that this driver takes responsibility for what he did. And he went on to say that he doesn't care whether the driver spends 1 day or 10 years behind bars. To him, he has his closure. Now, Scott Thomas will have the opportunity to make a victim impact statement at the end of January 28th. It's been scheduled for 5 days. You can anticipate that there will be a lot of victim impact statements. 29 families affected by this crash, the survivors, the parents of those who died, grandparents, teammates, it goes on and on. So that will take 5 days. As well, we will hear the details of the crash from the RCMP, the accident reconstruction. There will be many factors that go into this when the defense argues for the smallest sentence possible, likely for this truck driver.
Now, that said, the provincial government did announce several changes would be made at the intersection where the crash occurred, and that followed a safety review. That is, of course, outside of this court case, but tell us about what we heard from the province there.
Well, it is important that you brought that up, Michael, because I think that report will play a factor in the sentencing, since the defense will point to some of the circumstances around that intersection. The government has pointed out that it will remove some trees that may impede visibility. It will put in rumble strips. It will improve signage, things that will make that intersection safer. And it is possible that the defense will point to that to say that there are other factors around this crash rather than simply running through a stop sign.
And our thanks to the CBC's Bonnie Allen in Melfort, Saskatchewan. Well, with that, we want to bring in CBC News senior correspondent Susan Harmison. She's been covering this story quite closely. Susan, thank you for coming in. I know many viewers are aware of this, but in the aftermath of the crash, you spent a lot of time with the families of the Humboldt Bronco victims. I wonder what today's development might mean to them.
Well, it's painful. You could see Scott Thomas, the father of Evan, killed in that crash, struggling to contain his emotions outside that courtroom. Can you imagine just reliving that moment? They've spent the 9 or 10 months since April 6th last year trying to move on with their lives, and now they have this next chapter which is essential and necessary, but they have to get through it. Those days at the end of January are going to be really emotional. We don't know how many of the families will stand up in court to give a victim impact statement. In a way, the whole world knows the impact of this crash, so this will be their personal moment. I don't think that we can realistically and reliably say that everyone feels the same, Michael. Scott Thomas says he doesn't care how much time this truck driver gets. Other families may not feel that way. There's still resentment, there's anger that this could actually happen. And one of the families I spoke to this morning said, in fact, the truck driver is one part of this system, but as Bonnie Allen just said, there were also problems, 6 other crashes at that intersection in the last 28 years. One of them very fatal, 6 other people died. So somewhere along the line, the authorities also dropped the ball in transport safety. And so the truck driver is a piece of this, but the families are also concerned and upset about the things that weren't done to make that intersection safer.
And how much of that is from the families themselves? Because, as we said, you spent a lot of time with them. What type of grief have they expressed to you? What type of difficulty have they expressed to you about the weeks that followed that horrible crash?
Well, in the beginning, it was shock. But it was also that when, some of them got to the crash, Scott Thomas was in a car behind the bus, 45 minutes behind. He got to the site, he couldn't get through. And he said at the time that RCMP told him that the truck driver said that the sun was in his eyes. Well, there didn't seem to be a sun at that level on the horizon at that time. So there was a lot of conflicting information and facts. I think that they've been weeding through and walking through all this information. I think what will be equally important at the end of this month is the final good look at the facts. What did the RCMP investigation actually tell us about that crash? What happened? Was he on his phone? Did he blow through? What actually happened? Facts or information, it does help in the process, but it doesn't bring anyone back. Yeah, that's the obvious, sad conclusion. What it does is provide some kind of closure that someone is responsible, that someone is taking responsibility. And I'll tell you that the defense lawyer in this case, Mark Brayford, he's a very experienced defense counsel in Saskatchewan. He took over the case recently. I'm sure that he had an impact on how this transpired today, and he will be trying to counsel his client and also prepare his defense for the sentencing.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Brayford because it's through Brayford that we had a little bit of insight in Sidhu and why he pleaded guilty to all 29 charges that he was facing. And part of the reason why is because he says he did not want to make this any more difficult for the families, and at the same time extended his thanks to the family members of victims who expressed their sympathy for what he was going through. Did that surprise you?
No, I think that, you know, there's a whole range of emotions here. I haven't crossed anyone in this horrible tragedy that believed that this truck driver did this deliberately. So it was a horrible, horrible mistake. And even those who are in the middle of this trauma can understand that his life has been ruined as well, this truck driver. So I wasn't surprised at what was said. I think many people would think this is a good conclusion, that the guilty plea was important, that no one wanted to fight a case going through probably up until the first anniversary of this crash. So an important development today, and I think this will be, you know, that courtroom when the families are able to stand up and say, this is how we feel. We may hear some more words about how they feel about the truck driver too. Mm-hmm.
How has all of this changed the community?
Oh, well, communities. I mean, you know, more than half a dozen of the players were from Alberta, a couple from Manitoba, one at least, many from Saskatchewan. I grew up in Saskatchewan. It's a hockey province. The whole prairies are. You know what kind of response there was to this tragedy. Mm-hmm. The community is still trying to deal with it. I was out there in September for the first home game of the Broncos. They would like to avoid being the center of attention of the world again, because it's been hard. It's a small place. We've just seen the coach let go of the Broncos, walked away from his job. They've got a new coach. So it has not been smooth. Who would have dreamed it could be after this event?
Mm-hmm. And as you say, this story having resonance for so many Canadians, because to send your son to play hockey, the national pastime, to go to an away game, something many, many Canadians can relate to. Susan, thank you for this. We'll speak again.
You're welcome.